Okay, so as Drago mentioned, my name is Bridget Klein. I'll be using this sign name. If you see it, that means it's me. And a little bit about who I am. As Drago mentioned, my name is Bridget. I am from Wisconsin, a very, very small town in Wisconsin, predominantly white, maybe one or two Black families that are located in Wisconsin, which pretty much describes the entirety of the southern region. I grew up in a farm area, which is the reason you see this beautiful painting on the right-hand side. And as a visual description, there's a cow with a rainbow on the left, some symbols. The fencing is a red color, which represents a bit of who I am and my love for farm animals and farmland and my connection with nature. A little bit about my background. So today is April 9th, 2022, and I have a history. 25 years ago, I got a graduation gift from an older lesbian who is hearing. She was an interpreter, and I worked with two interpreters, and one of them gave me this button. And the button reads, "I like older women." And I have held on to this button, a pin, if you will. And I look back to the moment that I graduated and the moment that I got this gift. And this was created in 1965, the button. And I held on to this. And this was my first foray in being honored from folks who shared an identity to mine. This is 20 years ago when I went into college at NTID RIT, and that is when I saw a diaspora of people compared to my growing up in Wisconsin. I grew up, like I mentioned, in a very white town, and I realized that I wanted more. And I wanted more socially and also research-wise. So I started a project for Deaf Women's Studies, and that was with Vicki Hurwitz, who was a professor, teacher of Deaf Studies at NTID, National Technical Institute for the Deaf, located at Rochester Institute for Technology. And this first project was done with Vicki Horwitz. And I remember it being the first conversation that I had with a fellow deaf lesbian. And there was an individual that I thought, like, wow, I'm just here and I'm going to do my work and I'm going to pass this class. But I didn't remember until I looked back at the historical experiences of my life as a deaf lesbian that she was a game changer in my life. 13 years ago, I decided to enter American University in their PhD program, and my study was anthropology and culture and people. And my focus was in that moment, I decided to focus on deaf lesbian history. I am a storyteller by nature. I've always been enamored by stories, and I wanted to look into it at a much closer level. So that was 2019. Nope, I have got the wrong date as I'm thinking out loud. It was 2009 that I went into American University and started my PhD program. And this is when I made the decision to start getting into the nitty-gritty of what it looks like for deaf lesbian women and what our history is. Because honestly, I didn't know. I didn't have anybody to look up to. I didn't have anybody that had any formal history where we could share that this is what deaf lesbian history is. So this is a screenshot of a video asking about life stories of deaf lesbians and who wanted to share those stories with me. And this was a call for those stories, and I then furthered it into my PhD dissertation study. Just 2 months ago, I finally graduated. And when I say finally, I mean finally, because it was a journey. A lot of frustration, a lot of barriers, a lot of taking 2 steps forward and 20 steps back, and figuring out that when I walked on stage, I had to be so grateful to the stories that came along with me, for the shoulders that I was standing on. And when I was walking to get this degree of mine, I can't be loud enough in saying thank you to the people that allowed for this success. Not only the stories that were told, but the people that supported me along the way. And the work that was done because of them is something that I want to tip my hat to, because their stories, their lived experiences show that we do in fact have a history. And when people say there's not enough visibility, there's not enough history, there's not enough story, that's not correct. There has been, we just have not been uplifted. So my research started in the focus of the time period between 1945 and current to current, when I just graduated. So 1945 until 2020, we'll call that current. And that's the period of history that I focused on. So I'd like to clarify a few things when I mention the term history. You may have been noticing that I'm using the sign GL on my chin. So that represents gay, lesbian communities. And there was a very distinct difference during those times between the role of gay men and lesbian women. It was very much something that was not connected. And it was very obvious that people wanted to be referred to in particular ways. Things have changed, and the gender binary is now uplifted and highlighted, and options for identities have been expanded so much compared to the time that I was around. So I want to clarify, when I'm using that term, it's because I'm focusing on those identities during those particular time and the language of lesbianism as sexuality and genderism as women. So the experiences of being a lesbian woman in the deaf community is very specific in my study. And this quote here on the screen is very true. And I'm one who agrees with Madeline Davis, who is an author and wrote books about the collection of the lesbian experience in Buffalo, New York. And her experience was one of hearing lesbians. And I agree 1000% with this quote that says, as gays, they have a past, but no history, because people were in solitude. People were oftentimes isolated, and their experiences were theirs and were not shared. History was unknown to so many individuals. So gays and lesbians didn't grow up being immersed in that history, including me. And it is something that I myself had to search for. Hence the ask for all of the lived experiences from the deaf lesbian individuals. And each of those were solitary moments that were gathered into this beautifully rich history that showed themes within our communities. The work of Davis was done in tandem with Elizabeth Lepofsky Kennedy. They worked together in writing this text. And Kennedy's studies were focusing on the anthropology of lesbian history. She also identified as a lesbian, an anthropologist, and a historian, and was the founder of the Women's Studies College at Buffalo, SUNY, New York. And that was also one of the first in the United States. All of these documentations happened before the protest in 1969. And I'd like to also clarify that deaf lesbian women and deaf gay men were both witnessing three different types of transformations, three different shifts in society. This is one of the shifts that happened, the Stonewall riots, happening in 1969. And that's when gays and lesbians finally said, we will be visible with your consent or not. And in 1965, that is when deaf individuals recognized that American Sign Language, by William Stokey's research, recognized that American Sign Language was in fact its own language. And Stokoe, along with a fellow deaf group of authors, found that American Sign Language was in fact a language with its own syntax and its own grammar. And then the third shift in society, so I mentioned 1969 Stonewall, 1965 Stokoe, and then around the 1970s, the second wave of feminism, fighting for equality, fighting for the legal rights of protection, fighting for equal pay for women, and so forth. So rights for women in general increased significantly. So these three shifts occurred, the first two being in the deaf communities, and the second being specifically in communities of women. For women who were older, and when I say older, I'm going to refer to women who were over the age of 60, the experience of these three shifts in society were ones that they lived on their own. And I myself, being a deaf lesbian over the age of 60, want to honor that history. And as I mentioned, tip my hat and give reverence to those individuals who fought for me and continue to do so. And that's the reason I want to share these stories, so that they will then be recognized. So society and social norms were very different back in the day compared to where we are now. And I'm not sure if you can see the specifics in the picture here, so let me describe them. The picture itself is a man in the forefront of the photo, and he's wearing a robe. And in front of him is a counter with paper towels and slices of bacon. We can assume that this is dad in the photo. And then behind the dad are two children, and behind the children is mom in an apron. So this in itself connotes and denotes that man is number one. And man is the breadwinner and mom is the caretaker. And this was very much a societal standard that folks conform to when we talk about heteronormativity. So these are straight standards in society. Now, when we think about deaf lesbians in their older age in 1960s, I asked them what they thought about the word lesbian, and was that something that they had access to? And each and every one of them said they didn't even know that word until later on in life, much later on in life. Now remember, 1973, so prior to the year 1973, the gay and lesbian community were considered a sin. We were considered, even in the DSM manual, we were considered individuals who should not be part of society. We had illness. So before the 1973 shift, we were ones that could not share our identity. We had to live in secret. And we were told, do not tell people that you are a lesbian. So we were taboo. Not only could we not identify as being a lesbian, we couldn't even talk about it. Now let's talk about spaces. And again, we're talking about spaces and how society and systems were established for heteronormativity. On the screen are 4 different circles that categorize society and how people viewed straight hearing people, queer hearing people, straight deaf people, and straight deaf men. Okay, so we'll envision them in this system of society. If you were a queer hearing person, this meant that you could hang at a bar, or you could celebrate your pride through parade or exhibition. For straight deaf people, your space included deaf clubs, included schools for the deaf, dorms where you would socialize with your fellow deaf peers. And the very last was for straight deaf men. And their space was how they navigated the world with deaf lesbian women. So these are different spaces that you experience in the world and how you navigate your identity through those respective spaces. I'll be signing this particular sign for this ascendancy of who is the majority and who is of who is the folks that are welcome in that space. And let's say, for example, if you are in a lesbian bar, gay bar, and you are a hearing lesbian, then your ascension is very different than a deaf lesbian. If you are in a deaf club, then straight deaf folks would be lower in the ascending line than queer folks. So in my studies, I gathered how individuals navigated life in these particular spaces and how they did so based on societal norms, based on systems. So these individuals were marginalized as linguistic minorities, in addition to being a lesbian deaf person or being a queer deaf person, and then how those internal marginalizations happened within particular spaces. And if that's not clear, please do let me know. Now, for deaf, gay, and lesbian individuals, we had to figure out how to maneuver in those spaces. And in some of those spaces, we were the number one on the line of ascension. And how we navigated that space was very different than we did in majority spaces. Here are some examples of individuals being in dominant spaces versus non-dominant spaces. So one example would be two spaces, one being straight deaf space and hearing gay and lesbian space, and how those gay and lesbian individuals felt marginalized or kept out of those straight hearing spaces. And this is a part of the analysis I did with my dissertation specific to language use. Deaf folks do have bilingual skills. We also have two modes of communication, one being written and one being signed. So this language here was a language of resistance that we were using in these spaces. So that language of resistance is something that made us different in these majority spaces, but that was our way of speaking up and being seen. So those two language modes that we used, written English and American Sign Language, were the languages that we used to resist majority culture. Now, when we talk of straight deaf space, you may look at this and think, why would you research this? And I'll share with you why. Because this space of heteronormativity meant that they were the majority culture. So they were what society saw as the norm. The stigmatization that happened because of language occurred in these spaces. And I'm going to define for you what I mean by this. If individuals all shared a particular space, then they were seen as the norm. And then another individual came in and were automatically stigmatized rather, because they had a different identity. So they were automatically seen as different. Deaf, gay, and lesbian individuals experienced two types of marginalization, either being deaf and or being gay and lesbian. Now let's focus on deaf individuals in college. Now this is, again, as a reminder, back in the 1960s. Gallaudet was the only college that deaf folks could go to during that time because NTID was not established until much later. So Gallaudet was the one choice that deaf folks had. So we're talking about the 60s versus NTID, which was closer to the 1970s when it was established. So reading and writing the Buff and Blue newspaper that was out for gay and lesbian individuals wasn't until the 80s now I'm talking about. So for individuals who were in college as deaf people at Gallaudet University and progressing through, now had access to written English. What happened because of this access, the news that were being shared, and this is before 1984, before 1984, there was an attempt to establish an organization specific to gay and lesbian deaf folks. And there were resistance and fighting to have a student body government approving this gay and lesbian organization. And it was continually denied access and turned down because of stigma. So this is one way of, again, being stigmatized and marginalized from our own deaf communities. On the screen is April 13, 1984 screenshot of the Buff and Blue, where another uprising occurred. And the picture is very difficult to make out. What is in the picture is an audience that are berating, I want to say upwards of 200 individuals who are berating an individual who is saying, I would like to set up an organization called the Lambda Debate, the Lambda Sigma Society. Pardon the interpreter, the Lambda Society, LSGC. So this organization, again, in the 1980s, was one that this individual wanted to set up at Gallaudet. And this one solo individual was trying to defend the reason for establishing an organization of like-minded and like-identity individuals, and were openly berated by an audience of fellow deaf individuals. So again, you see here in the fall, September 28th, 1984, another attempt at establishing this group. And finally, I want to say around November, this group was then approved as an organization through the student body government. In the May 1984 timestamp you have here concludes a summary of all of the events that happened during the spring semester at Gallaudet College in 1984, including the auditorium berating, the attempt at passing, the denial, and so forth. And finally, when this organization was established, we have documentation in the Tower Clock yearbook in 1987. 1987, and they had been attempting this since the beginning of the 1960s. So when in 1984 they thought they had the organization approved from the student body government, what they realized was that there was no documentation, and 1987, 3 years later, was the first public documentation that this organization and club existed. So for years they fought to establish, and then for years they fought, for 10 years they fought to establish, and then finally, after the 3 years of the establishment through student body government, they got public proclamation that it existed. So imagine all of the energy and time that it took to do so. And if we think about Gallaudet University now, who has the Rainbow Society, who, and this is the sign for those of you who are not familiar, compared to what all of these individuals had to fight for back in the 60s through the 80s. So now when we talk about communities, I mean community anywhere in the United States. The deaf communities include a variety of settings, but for one newspaper that actually had an open conversation from deaf, straight individuals who were struggling with the identities of deaf, queer individuals is the following newspaper. And there's a picture of it here on screen, which is the Deaf Community News in Massachusetts. And the reason is because the deaf individuals who were gay and lesbian refused to out or be outed. Oh, and I forgot to share with you this logo. So remember this logo that you're seeing here, the I love you sign on the screen. People were terrified. Virtually all the gay men and lesbians interviewed refused to allow the deaf community news to print their names because they were terrified. They had already had their own experiences and witnessed other experiences that were terrifying. So on the screen here, you see news and community gossip. And if we think about 1980, technological advances were very different than right now. We did not have Zoom like we're communicating today on screen. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have any of the access for information sharing until the early 1990s. So much, much later in life. And where information sharing happened and resources happened were through shared stories. And how could we, for those who are struggling with their identities, share what they were when we didn't have access to this technology? So there were three options that we had: information sharing personally, radio, which is something that we didn't have access to, and television, which is something that we didn't have access to because captions weren't something that were legally required until the ADA was passed. So we reverted to newspapers. So I myself, who was a person who grew up in a farm town at the age of 15, had to rely on information that was very limited. Our town newspaper was very different than national news. So information for me was very limited. When you think about access to information in the library resources didn't openly have gay and lesbian information accessible for anybody, never mind deaf folks. And remember at that time, the 1980s-ish, we were not celebrating gay and lesbian identities in the way that we are today. It was still very much taboo. So that meant for somebody who had a deaf identity to share with one other person that was deaf that they were gay and lesbian was absolutely sacrilege, because that information would have been shared as fast as birds fly. So gay and lesbian individuals were people who didn't want to share their identity because they knew that information sharing was so sacred to deaf individuals, and we didn't have space to be open about our identities. Now, when we talk about ASL, specifically in deaf space, let's remember that fear that the individuals had in their names and identities being outed in this small community newspaper, because this wasn't just published in Massachusetts. It was published in Massachusetts, and then people outside were learning from their deaf Massachusetts friends. So we didn't have access to media, TV, radio, and this is what we were leaning on. So sometimes, perhaps not intentionally, information was shared without consent. And we'll talk again about, as I mentioned, I analyzed communication and language about the stigmatization of deaf individuals. So you see here, there are different signs that are openly offensive utilized for the term gay. So when gay and lesbian individuals saw those signs, this is what they were referred to as. Now, are these signs that are still being openly used today? That's a good question. And there are two different ways that sign language harms gay and lesbian people. And I'm bothered by this sign for homosexual. And this was referred to as a clinical disorder and something that was in the DSM as a psychological or psychosocial issue. And I look at these two signs that are openly mocking and harmful, and I wonder more so what the clinical view and interpretation of this is. And again, here is another representation of this same sign, which is extremely offensive to individuals. Now, for my dissertation, I did a lit review and I gathered all of the information necessary to continue my research. And I had conversations with deaf lesbian women who had their own signs that had not been documented in the lit review that were utilized for offensive purposes. So, for example, the sign for lesbian that was used in a much more hidden connotation. And that meant that lesbians had a negative representation. They were sad and poor and not represented in a positive manner of society. So the orientation and hand shape and palm was very much disconnected from their deaf being. And then another sign that you see here in Joe's screenshot is an L that's turned in the opposite orientation than how we would actually sign. So again, these emphasized the stigma and negativity of deaf lesbians. Now, when we talk about intersectionality, we have to honor race, gender, and sexuality in these individuals' respective identities. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw was the individual who established the concept of intersectionality, and it was specific to Black women and how they were seen in society because of their race, gender, and sexuality. And the intent for Dr. Crenshaw was to look at individuals' identities and not just one identity that they carried. Now, the conversations that I had with these deaf lesbian women were 24 individuals that I spoke with. And out of those 24, there were only 3 women of color identifying as Black and brown women who were lesbian. So I think to myself, out of 24, only 3. So I'm thinking there's got to be so many more stories, and there's something that's so critical that's being missed. Now, this story by Sally Mae is something that she speaks about in being a deaf Black lesbian woman. And I'll play this video for you now. And Sally Mae is saying, I wanted to be a part of the Gallaudet story, but it was not something that I had access to. I would have been punished. I would have been, for my identity, I would have been a scapegoat for all the other things that were happening. Absolutely, it was not safe to be a lesbian. I would have been kicked out. I would have been harmed. I did not want anybody to know. I didn't want to look like I was queer. I couldn't date anybody, even a gay man. Like, some of us would use each other as beards so that we could hide identities and not be kicked out. I mean, we could have been kicked out of school. I mean, we would have been, I can't tell you, it was hell. We were punished for any of the identities that were queer that we were sharing. So if you think about residential school and then going into Gallaudet University, I didn't even go back to Virginia for 30 years because I was fearful for my life because of my identity. And I just traveled anywhere but Virginia because I didn't want to be harmed. So I'd like to clarify that intersectionality is something that was specific to Black women. And this intersectional identity carries being Black, being deaf, and being a lesbian. So for somebody who went into a residential school for Black deaf kids in Virginia versus a white residential school because they were segregated, the Black school for the deaf and the white high school, and then going into Gallaudet were Sally Mae's trajectory. And to realize how difficult it was for her to navigate Virginia for 30 years. So being a deaf lesbian, you already had to be cautious about the spaces that you were in. And I've heard stories like if you shaved your head, you were out. You were kicked out of college, you were kicked out of Gallaudet because you looked the part in ways that you were not supposed to. So this experience of race, gender, and sexuality and being deaf of Sally Mae's is so significantly powerful in this history. Now, the language of coming out in straight deaf space is something that is incomparable because we are constantly looked down upon in the majority deaf community of straight individuals. So how do we rectify our identity, and how do we actually come out, if at all, in straight deaf space. And that process of finding identity, which is so individual, and saying to yourself, I'm gay or I'm lesbian, is something that's so personal. And part of my lit review, going back to this lit review of the collection of information, includes this sign for coming out. And you see this sign for coming out, which seems normal to those of us who experience this coming out process, versus, fuck it, I'm out. Now remember, this individual is Elin Jacobovitz, who grew up in New York City, had organizations for gay and lesbian youth as a part of her everyday experience. And her experience was, fuck it, I'm coming out, not, oh my God, I have to come out. Now we look at this screenshot of MJ Bienvenue, who was terrified of being out. And this sign that she's using is representing that fear. And here's another screenshot of somebody coming out. And again, the process of coming out. Now, this is an older deaf lesbian woman who I applaud to no end. This is Dr. Barbara Canapel, fondly known as Canny. And Canny had a process of coming out in a variety of ways and spaces, shared it personally and individually, and then in smaller group settings and in a much more public way, which you can see here on these screenshots. And that process included testing the waters. If I come out in this space, am I safe? Do I then put myself back in the closet, depending on what the reactions are? Now, again, we talk about the stereotyping and the negativity of coming out in deaf space, and then also the languages of how we can sort of negotiate the spaces that we're in, and how do we utilize specific codes. We used specific codes in sign language to cover up and also to find out who was gay like us. So here was one of those signs where we would pinch our ear, and that meant anybody else here gay too? Or are you one of them? Are you one? Just like you see here on the screen. And then the screenshot here, green and yellow. And I actually saw both green and yellow, and then just the combination of signs, green, yellow. I've actually seen those over the years. And I actually had conversations with a hearing individual who had several gay hearing men that they were friends with, and I happened to have connections with them. And I asked if those folks used the terms green and yellow. I asked each and every one of those individuals, and none of them had ever used that code. So it seems as though this was only for deaf, gay, and lesbian communities, not for hearing gay and lesbian communities. Another code was one of them. Are you one of them? S was straight, B was bi, and G was gay. So which one are you? That was during my Gallaudet days. That was a code that we used, SBG. It was not student body government, it was stray, bi, gay. So that's how we would get by in figuring out who our communities were. Then the other sign, during Northwest Campus times at prep, we would pinch our ear, and then also we would use a white sock in the back pocket, and we knew that was like a guy thing, that they would denote that they were gay. And through our years in freshman year in college, rather, we started using the SBG thing and people thought it was student body government. And they were like, oh, no, 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 no. So now those labels are no longer used. I don't see those codes anymore. You're right. Those codes have really disbanded over the years, and we don't use green and yellow. We don't use one of them. We don't use RU1. We don't use any of those things. And I think what's important for us to remember is the integral part of history that these codes were. Not only codes that were safe language codes, but the ones that were insulting and demeaning as well, so that we do have documentation of those codes. And there is a screenshot of the SBG signs that we just discussed. Tom Kane, I'll use Tom's sign name here for those of you who would like to know. Published in the Washington Blade newspaper, which was a gay newspaper in Washington, D.C. in 1986, the following. There were 3 signs, gay, bi, and straights, used during those times. Gay was signed like golf, starting with a G. Straight, you would sign softball. And basketball would represent the concept of being bisexual, S, B, and G. So the language of passing in straight deaf space. Let me take a pause here just for a second, because right now it's coming on 2 o'clock, and I have a lot more PowerPoint slides here. So I'm going to jump a bit, and you can give me just one moment to jump to the spot that I want to share.
Just give me one moment to reshare my screen and get to the right place. Sorry, just one moment. Okay, here we go. You see the slide here? And this is what I'm calling reappropriation, that how negative signs regarding gay and lesbian people from the straight community were taken back and used by us in a more powerful way. This idea, am I too butch? Straight girls. And again, this is Lynn Jacobowitz. I'm trying to spell her name right. Jacobowitz. Yes, okay. When deaf straight women or girls say, ooh, you're really butch. And then you say, oh, am I more butcher than your boyfriend? That was a way of taking back the power of that label and actually using it as a badge of honor, so to speak. Same thing here, taking back the negative sign of what was used for gay. Play this video here for you. I remember I would do it like this. I'm going to this place, this specific place that was, a designated place for us, by us, and for us. Yeah, this is intergroup dialogue. This is very intimate register. To do it that way, would only be signed amongst gay men with each other. But that was a way to take that sign back, the way that straight people would use it as an insult, and we use it again as representing something that is a place of joy for us. How gay and lesbians would use signs to reappropriate, saying this marginalization we do not accept, and we will use this in our own terms. So taking back our space. When we talk about space, it's mostly the majority, straight people, straight deaf people. But sometimes what happens with this reappropriation is we take our space back. So during Deaf Way 1, gay and lesbian people got there early at the gala, and we got the table in the center of the gala, and we took center stage. And we did that purposefully because historically, when conferences would happen and hundreds of deaf people would be, in a gala the last night of a conference, the deaf straight people would take all the best seats, and the gays and lesbians would be on the outskirts. And sometimes we would meet in secret and very carefully because we didn't want people to know because of what would happen. But not at Deaf Way 1. We were loud and proud, and that was very intentional. It's a way to reappropriate, to take back our power, to take back not only the use of language, but to take back our space. So now we say, okay, we have all this information about signs and how they've changed and why, and taking back space is also taking back language. And how do we do that? Again, I'm going to just give me a moment, please. I'm going to go back through the PowerPoint and skip to the part that I want. Just one moment, please. Okay, here we go. A language of our own. We do have our own publications, not just Buff and Blue or community newspapers, but our own community. CTN, Coming Together News. That's our publication. We also have our own Gallaudet publication as well. Lavender Gazette. We had an ASL Lavender Linguistic conferences where we've come together in an academic setting to discuss language. 1993 to 1997, we had these conferences. This picture was actually taken by Drago. And Valley, Dr. Clayton Valley. Valley's here with Canny, Dr. Canapel, and both of them well-known linguists, deaf linguists here in the DC area. Unfortunately, both of them have passed now. This was the last Lavender conference we had 25 years ago. If you think about it, all that rich information and robust research that came out of that conference was like a heartbeat that has stopped for 25 years. The Lavender Conference, we're calling it Lavender Language Conference, the signing this way, went from 1993 every year to 97. And now we're looking to host another conference again this fall in 2022 to have that heartbeat start again. You know, this is very important that, you know, we think about the photo of Canny and Valley that you just saw, for example. They were pioneers and they're gone. So their library has burned. Their stories are gone. They're gone that in the way that they can't tell them again because they're not here with us. However, we do have them preserved on video. I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you, Drago, for the Deaf Queer Resource Center. Thank everyone that was with me through this process, through my PhD, people that have interviewed with me. I very, very much appreciate all of your stories because we need more. We don't have enough of them. We only have 24 in terms of the research stories that we have, and we need much more. So please share your stories, and I thank you for being here. I'm going to open it up now.
Thank you so much, Bridget. What a wonderful presentation. So fascinating. Does anybody have a question in the audience? Please post in the chat if you have any questions for Bridget.
Because I could talk about this all day, so bring it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we have more space here. Question for Bridget.
Bridget's also saying we have interpreters here, so for folks who would like to use interpreters to ask questions, please feel free. Hi, Bridget, can you see me?
Yep.
Great. My name is Hugh Woodson. I want to say thank you so much for your presentation. I learned a lot about this history, and I'm actually 23 and I'm thinking about like, wow, how much history there really is. And I'm so appreciative. So when you talk about the ASL Lavender Conference, do you happen to know any details that you can share now, like where it's located?
Oh, good question. Sure. We're working on some of the programming details, and we want to do it virtually because we're still amongst, everything going on with the pandemic. But it would be during Gallaudet's homecoming, and we don't want to overlap with Gallaudet's homecoming. So we're looking to do it in the fall. We're looking for a specific date that doesn't conflict with other things, and we're still working on the details, but it will be in the fall. Thank you.
Okay, and I have another question for you.
Sure.
So for the Black folks that were in the group that you researched and interviewed, I know that there is a more traditional view of, how do I say this? Not feeling like coming out is safe. So for Black folks, we tend to not do this formal coming out process, and we often sit in silence and suffer. So when you think about the difference between then and now and how people are openly coming out in places versus where it was so private, and I wonder by chance if you see a difference because of like laws passing, or why is it different now than before?
Yes. Yeah. I don't want to give the wrong idea. I'm going to, again, this is my assumption based on my own research that I would say, and this is for hearing people, right? So hearing Black, either male or female, uh, Black people are, they get together as part like family, right? As a, and then if there's someone else that's not in that group that's Black or either white, then they could, if they're Black, then maybe they're not gay. If they're white, it's almost like Black people don't want to lose their family, right? So they would stay together regardless if they, you know, they accept each other for being who they are. I think is what my research tells me.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And just an interpreter clarification. It's because the spaces that are predominantly available for deaf lesbians and queer people are white spaces. So white bars, white what have you. So Black folks really congregated within their family spaces.
Right. And to add to that, yeah, talking about Black hearing people, Black deaf people, yes, I would say even more so. That's the case. True. Yeah. That, you know, their support systems are within the family and they keep those systems intact. Thank you, Hugh. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see the question in the chat. My apologies. My dissertation is 300 pages. And I had to go into detail about each one of those spaces distinctively, and it was a lot. It would be nice if one day I could, you know, put this all in a not any in a book, but on video. I want to publish in video as well, because what I've seen with my literature reviews is, you know, all of those things are written in English. And when we talk about deaf, gay, and lesbians that we have research, it's still printed. It's not in their own language. It's not in ASL. I want to print something in ASL. I'm just looking at the question here again. That is a good question. Yeah, in terms of the differences, a lesbian East Coast and West Coast, I would say, you know, women have their own right to decide, right? Straight, deaf men don't have a right to sign lesbian in a certain way, right? They do not have that right to make that decision. And when they do it that way, it's offensive. And they do that because straight, you know, predominantly majority culture men are, you know, and it's using that sign in a way of disrespect to deaf women lesbians. So lesbians can sign it however they want to, right? But straight white men have no right to sign it in that derogatory way. Also, just to clarify for that other question, I just graduated. I will continue to do this type of thing, and I'm looking to publish, a book or on a website. And please, come to the Lavender Language Conference. Would love to have you there too. There's another question in the chat. Yeah, I guess it depends on whatever space you're in. I'm sorry. Should I read the question here? So we're talking about stigma and the stigma, and what would you say was experienced more professionally? Well, there's different types of aggression. It just depends on the space and where you work. If you work at a school for the deaf, or if you work at Gallaudet, or if you work in just any kind of majority hearing situation, or you home alone, or you working from home, or where are you? So all of these contexts then will sort of ascribe how language is used, and the idea of language and culture when it's coming from deaf people that identify with that particular identity, and how they develop language, and how it's used amongst each other as opposed to with others. There's a lot of factors to consider there. Oh, and just another thing that's come to mind is, again, thinking about the time period, right? Because this is historical. So you're talking about the 60s, or you're talking about current day, and who do you hang out with, and who knows you, and who, so it just depends on, again, context and time period, I would say. Let me say one more thing. We're talking about marginalization and how language is used to do that. If a person may feel that they are having feelings that they're not sure about their own identity and questioning, they have to sort of disengage from their current, surroundings, and find a way to sort of make headway into communities that they may feel they identify with. And then once they are feeling more confident, are able to come back into their home communities as who they are now, as new people, and be able to stay strong in their own identity. And it's not just gay, lesbian, right? Because we're talking about layers and intersectionality. So there's autism that's layered in all of this as well. Again, you want me to talk? I can keep talking. I can keep talking all day. I love talking about this stuff. Well, I would say yes. I mean, as gays and lesbians that are deaf, we do have our own spaces. House parties, for example. That's when we got together. Women got together, had house parties. That's what we did. In 1998, that's when we had the first Deaf Lesbian Festival, DLF. 98 was when we had our first celebration gathering in an official, recognized way. 98, much later, right? Before that, we just had house parties. Then we had a big one. Just one moment. Now I see the other question. So before, there used to be, gays and lesbians were very separate in their social function and cultural identity, but now we've more come together. And I think it's because now federally we have marriage equality, and that really made a huge difference in terms of our rights. But some of those private spaces that we had no longer exist. We're more part of the mainstream, so to speak, if you will, being more accepted. People are more open now. There's not as much of a negative stigma so much. And I may be a little wrong on this, but from what I can see, the stories before were really negative and regarding marginalization because there was no recognition of human rights in that regard. But now we do have legal rights. We have, rights to marriage and such. There are some states, however, that still are behind the times, so to speak, but I would say that's the major difference now. Well, again, that's another discussion. I don't know if we have time to get into that, but the idea of intergroup versus outer group dialogue. Those dynamics are a whole nother discussion. Being with people that sign versus being with people that can't sign. Intergroup. Correction. So what you allow to be, what is allowed to sign amongst your intergroup is very different than what you're allowed to sign outside of that group, and what is acceptable and not acceptable. I mean, even the sign gay, for example. I can't sign gay. I have to spell G-A-Y. But gay men together sign that. And I might sign that with my gay men friends, but not when we're out. Only with people that know me in a specific setting with specific people. So, the analysis of this is when it's okay and not okay really is much more complicated than as it seems on the surface. Like men could never sign lesbian in a certain way, right? That would not be okay. So what's okay in terms of language? It's complicated. I sign gay and lesbian because this sort of combines both signs like this, gay, lesbian. But if I was signing gay alone, I would spell it G-A-Y. Okay, I think coming to a close here.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Beautiful job. Beautiful job. Thank you. Thank you for coming, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone who came. Thank you to the interpreters, Patty and Yolanta. So grateful for you. I hope you all enjoyed your time together. Our deaf queer history is very important, and that documentation is needed for future generations. So we're looking forward to more from you, Dr. Klein.
And you too, Drago.
All right. Thanks so much, folks. We're going to wrap up. Happy National LGBTQ Awareness Week. Love and light to you all.